Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. This is the next in our video series, The Christian Ethic in the 21st Century, and we're currently looking at the world of money and wealth and possessions. And in the last video we looked at what the Old Testament, which is the foundation document of Christianity, what it had to say about wealth, and there were 10 things that we looked at. And we ended that video with the thought that we're going to have a look at what the Old Testament has to say about the poor, those with no money or wealth. So let's continue. The Old Testament uses 3 words for poor. It uses the word dal, which means poor and weak and even emaciated. It is, for instance, the word that is used of the lean cattle in Pharaoh's dream that we read about in Genesis chapter 41 verse 19, and that word dal is often usually translated poor, as we read in Proverbs chapter 22 verses 9, 16 and 22, the book of Amos chapter 4 verse 1, chapter 5 verse 11 and chapter 8 verse 6. But it's sometimes translated as weak, as we read in Psalm 41 verse 1 and Psalm 82 verses 3 and 4. Sometimes it uses the word ebion, which is translated as needy, as we read in the book of Job chapter 5 verse 15, Psalm 69 verse 33, Psalm 140 verse 12, Proverbs chapter 14 verse 31, and Jeremiah 20 verse 13. So this word expresses the state of the man who is not only poor, but whose poverty has brought him oppression and abuse. Now again, I'm using the word man to denote everybody, men and women, people basically. So it uses the word ani, and this is what we might call the most developed word. It describes the man who is poor, without influence, oppressed. This man has no human help and no human resources, and is in such a state that his only help is in God, in whom he has put his trust. So it comes to mean the poor and humble man, whose whole and only trust is in God, as we read in Psalm chapter 34 verse 6, chapter 40 verse 17, Psalm 68:10, Psalm 86 verse 1, Proverbs chapter 14 verse 21, and the book of Isaiah chapter 66 verse 2. So there emerges then something which is very much a dominant part of the pattern, and that is the fact that the poor man is specially the concern of God. So let's look at a few things. Firstly, there is laid upon men the special duty of remembering and helping the poor. Both the wise man and the psalmist speak of the happiness of the man who remembers the poor, as we read in Psalms chapter 41 verse 1 and Proverbs chapter 14 verse 21. Now it is a part of a good man's duty to maintain the rights of the poor and the needy, as we read in the book of Proverbs chapter 31 verse 9. The good man does not regard the rich more than the poor, as we read in the book of Job chapter 34 verse 19. The command of God is, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked, as we read in the book of Psalms 82 verses 3 and 4. Only if a king judges the poor with equity will his throne be established forever, as we read in the book of Proverbs chapter 29 verse 14. So as the Old Testament sees it, it is an essential part of a good man's duty to remember, to help and to defend the poor. Now secondly, in the Old Testament there is also consistent condemnation for those who neglect or ill-treat the poor. It is the wicked who persecute the poor, as we read in Psalm chapter 10 verse 2. Part of Isaiah's condemnation of the wicked is that the spoil or the possessions of the poor is in their houses, as we read in the book of Isaiah chapter 3 verses 14 and 15. Woe to those who make Woe to those who make iniquitous decrees to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their rights. Very emotional verse that. That's Isaiah chapter 10 verses 1 and 2. It is the activity of the wicked to ruin the poor with lying words, even when the plea of the needy is right, as we read in the book of Isaiah chapter 32 verse 7. He who oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth will come to nothing else than want, as we read in the book of Proverbs chapter 27 verse 6. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor, but a wicked man does not understand such knowledge, as we read in Proverbs chapter 29 verse 7. So it has been said that the voice of the prophets is often nothing other than a cry for social justice. So the care of the poor is an essential duty laid on the man who wishes to see the world as God meant it to be. Thirdly, in the Old Testament, the care of the poor is laid down not only as a duty to man, but also as a duty to God. It is something which has to be done not only for the sake of the poor, but also for the sake of God. Jeremiah says of a good man, he judged the cause of the poor and the needy, then it was well. Is not this to know me, says the Lord? As we read in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 22, verse 16. The wise man says, he who oppresses the poor insults his maker, but he who is kind to the needy honors him. That's Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31. So he who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, as we read in Proverbs chapter 19 verse 17. If a man closes his ear to the cry of the poor, God will close his ear to his cry, as we read in Proverbs 21 verse 13. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause and despoil the life of those who despoil them, as we read in the book of Proverbs chapter 22 verses 22 and 23. To help the poor is to help God. To be heartless to them is to incur his anger. How could it be otherwise? For to injure the child is always to anger the child's father, and to help the child is always to delight the child's father's heart. So fourthly, as we would expect from all of this, the Old Testament is sure that God cares for the poor in a very special way and rescues and delivers them. So this is a favourite thought in the Psalms. The Lord hears the needy, as we read in Psalms chapter 69 verse 33. God stands at the right hand of the needy, as we read in Psalm 109 verse 31. The needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever, as we read in Psalm 9 verse 18. The poor man cried, and the Lord heard him as we read in Psalm 44 verse 6. God in his kindness provides for the needy, as we read in Psalm 68 verse 10. God delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper, as we read in Psalm 72 verse 12. The Lord executes justice for the needy, as we read in Psalm 140 verse 12. He raises up the poor from the dust, as we read in the first book of Samuel chapter 2 verse 8. And with righteousness God will give justice to the poor, as we read in the book of Isaiah chapter 11 verse 4. So the poor man is under the care of God. The Old Testament does not despise wealth. It does not deny that there are things that wealth can do, but it will never make wealth the principal good. And it will always insist that to gain wealth wrongly and to use wealth selfishly are both to sin against God. Interesting, isn't it, how God regards the poor and the needy. In the next video, we'll be looking at what Jesus said about the use of money and wealth and possessions. So I want to thank you for joining me in this video. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.